So in the last lecture, you learned that this references the object that is executing the current function. All right, now let me show you a few different solutions to change the value of this in a function. So let's imagine our for each method doesn't have this second parameter. How can we change the value of this? Well, here is one simple solution. Before we call the for each method, we can define a constant, call it self, and setting it to this. Some people also call this that. It's more of a personal preference. There's no right or wrong. So let's call this self. Now at this point, self is referencing the video object here. So in our callback function, we can use self instead of this because the value of this changes when a new function is called. So at this point, this references the video object, but when we get to this callback function, this references the global object. So here we can use self, which is the original value of this, save the changes, and we get the title of the video here. Beautiful. Now, this is not the preferred approach, but it's something that you see in a lot of JavaScript applications out there. So I just want you to understand it, but don't use this approach. Now let's take a look at another approach. Earlier in the course, you learned that functions are objects in JavaScript. So let's define a function, call it play video. Here we do a console.log of this. So this function is technically an object. So it has properties and methods that we can access using the dot notation. Here we have three methods: apply, bind, and call. And with these, we can change the value of this for this function. The simplest is the call method. The first parameter of this method is this arg. So here we can pass an object, and this will reference that object. For example, I can pass a new object with the name property set to Mosh. Now, when we save the changes, we're going to see this object on the console. But before we get there, let me temporarily comment out this previous code. So save the changes. You see this new object. In contrast, if we call this function using the standard function call syntax, this references the window object. So this is the benefit of using the call method. We have another method that is similar to call, and that is called apply. So let me duplicate this line, change this to apply, save the changes. Again, we get the same result. So what we pass as the first argument here will be used as the value of this. The difference between call and apply is only about passing arguments. So if this function has multiple parameters, let's say a and b, we can supply multiple arguments here, 1 and 2. But with the apply method, we have to pass them as an array. So 1 and 2. That's the only difference. We have another method that is bind. So play video.bind. Once again, the first argument is this arg. So we can pass this object name Mosh. But this bind method does not call our play video function. It returns a new function and sets this to point to this object permanently. So no matter how we call that function, this will always point to this object that we pass here. So this returns the new function. We can store the result in a constant and now call this function just like a regular function. Save the changes. Once again, we get this new object here. Now, in this particular case, we don't really need this separate constant. We can delete this and immediately call the function that is returned from the bind method. Save the changes, we get the same result. So with call, apply, and bind, we can set this argument for a given function. Now, let's go back to our previous example. So let's delete all this code here. Back in the show tags method. So here we're passing this callback function, and in this function, we're going to use this. So we no longer need the self constant. However, as you know, by default here, this references the global object, but we want to change this. So here we have a function. We can call the bind method immediately here, and then pass an object to be used as the value of this. What should we pass here? This. Because as I told you before, at this point, we are in the show tags method. So this references our video object. So save the changes. And once again, you can see the title of the video next to each tag. So using the bind method is the second solution to solve this problem. But there is a newer and better solution. Starting from ECMAScript 6, we have arrow functions. The good thing about the arrow functions is that they inherit the this value. Let me show you what I mean by that. So let's remove the call to the bind method and change this function to an arrow function. So we remove the function keyword, put a fat arrow between the parameter and the body, and because we have a single parameter, we remove parentheses. Cleaner syntax. Now if you save the changes, we still get the same result without doing anything extra. The reason for this is because arrow functions inherit this from the containing function. So in this function, this references the video object. So when we pass an arrow function here, the same this value is used in this arrow function. In other words, this is not rebound to a new object. So let's quickly recap. In this lecture, you learned about 3 ways to change the value of this. The first solution was using the self approach. So the second solution was using the bind method. So right after defining this function, we call bind and pass this as the argument. But again, this is the old way of doing things. It's a little bit noisy, but you may still see it in a lot of JavaScript applications out there. So going forward, the modern approach to solve this particular problem when dealing with callbacks is to use an arrow function.